In the beginning of my journey with English, I never understood why teachers and more advanced learners kept repeating the advice to think directly in English. I believed that as long as I learned enough vocabulary and memorized grammar rules, I would eventually be able to speak fluently. For a long time, that was how I approached learning. Every time I wanted to say something, I first formed the sentence in my native language and then tried to translate it word by word. This method worked for very simple phrases, but the moment I wanted to share a more complex thought, everything slowed down. I felt trapped inside my own head, stuck between two languages, and constantly worried about whether my words were correct. I remember one moment clearly. I was at a coffee shop, sitting with a group of international friends. They were speaking quickly, laughing, and jumping from one topic to another. By the time I had translated a sentence in my head and prepared to respond, the conversation had already moved forward. I felt invisible, not because I had nothing to say, but because my process of translation was too slow to keep up. That day, I realized something needed to change. The breakthrough came gradually when I decided to practice thinking directly in English, even when I was alone. At first, it felt awkward. I would look out the window and say to myself in English, "It is raining today." Later, I would try more complicated thoughts, such as I should finish my homework before dinner or I feel nervous about tomorrow. These small exercises felt simple, but they trained my brain to skip the translation step. Slowly, I noticed that I was beginning to respond faster during conversations. Communication became more natural because I was no longer filtering everything through my native language. Speed was the first benefit I noticed. The hesitation that once held me back began to disappear. I could keep up with my friends, respond to questions more quickly, and even make jokes without worrying too much about accuracy. This change gave me a sense of freedom. I no longer felt like a student constantly testing myself. Instead, I felt like a participant in real conversations. The faster I spoke, the more natural the language began to feel. With this speed came confidence. In the past, my lack of confidence made me avoid speaking opportunities. I was afraid of making mistakes and embarrassing myself. But as I trained myself to think in English, I stopped obsessing over perfection. My focus shifted from translating correctly to expressing myself clearly. Even if I used a simple word instead of a fancy one, people understood me. That understanding gave me courage to continue. Confidence, I learned, does not come from knowing every grammar rule. It comes from trusting your ability to communicate. Another powerful change was in my listening skills. Before I started thinking in English, listening to movies or podcasts felt like running after a train that was always moving too fast. I tried to translate every sentence, and by the time I finished one, I had already missed the next. Once I stopped translating, I discovered that my brain could actually process meaning directly in English. At first it was challenging, but over time it became easier. I began to catch details I had never noticed before. Songs were clearer, conversations flowed more smoothly, and even lectures became easier to follow. Thinking in English trained my ears to connect with the rhythm of the language instead of breaking it into pieces. Perhaps the most rewarding part of thinking in English was the way it allowed me to express myself more naturally. My native language has its own beauty, but English gave me new shades of meaning. For example, instead of just saying happy, I could choose from words like cheerful, excited, delighted, or content. Each word carried a slightly different feeling. By thinking directly in English, I started to use these words in ways that reflected my emotions more precisely. It felt as if the language had opened a new window through which I could see myself and the world. This process was not easy, and I will not pretend that it happened overnight. In the beginning, I had to remind myself constantly to think in English. Sometimes I slipped back into old habits of translating, but I stayed consistent, practicing every day. I spoke to myself while walking, wrote simple thoughts in my journal, and even described my surroundings in English before going to sleep. The small daily steps created a habit, and the habit slowly built fluency. Looking back now, I realize that choosing to think in English was one of the most important decisions of my learning journey. It made communication faster, it gave me the confidence to speak without fear, it sharpened my listening skills, and it allowed me to express myself in a way that felt genuine and creative. More than that, it changed the way I connected with people. I no longer felt like an outsider observing conversations. I became part of them. Thinking in English taught me that fluency is not only about knowledge, but about mindset. It is about letting go of the safety of translation and trusting yourself to live in the language. It is about giving yourself permission to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to keep moving forward. Today, I no longer measure my progress only by the number of words I know or the grammar I can explain. I measure it by the moments I can express myself freely, listen with understanding, and connect with others in real time. That, for me, is the true success of learning a language. I used to believe that language was only a tool for communication. In my mind, words were like bridges, connecting one person to another, nothing more. But as I grew deeper into my journey with English, I began to realize that language does more than connect us. It shapes the way we think, the way we see the world, and even the way we imagine possibilities. My native language gave me one kind of lens, a familiar way of organizing thoughts. English, however, opened a new lens, expanding not only my ideas but also my creativity and my worldview. When I first began learning English, I treated it as a school subject. I studied grammar charts, memorized vocabulary, and practiced writing sentences. Everything was mechanical. I used English only as a second layer on top of my own language. For every thought, I would first form it in my native words and then search for English equivalents. At that stage, English felt narrow and limiting. I often complained to myself that I could never express the same depth of feeling in English as I could in my native tongue. But the shift began when I challenged myself to think directly in English. At first, it was simple. Instead of translating, I tried forming thoughts in English while walking to school or while waiting for the bus. My thoughts were short and plain, but something interesting began to happen. English did not simply copy my native ideas. It started shaping them differently. Sometimes I found expressions in English that had no direct equivalent in my first language, and they gave me new ways to describe experiences. This discovery opened my creativity in surprising ways. For example, in my native language, I would describe a day as bright or dark, but in English I could choose words like gloomy, radiant, dull, or sparkling. Each word carried a slightly different image. When I started using these words in my thoughts, my imagination became richer. I noticed details around me that I had never paid attention to before. A rainy day was no longer just wet. It could be refreshing, depressing, or soothing depending on how I framed it. English gave me more colors to paint my inner world. The more I thought in English, the more my worldview expanded. English introduced me to cultural concepts that my native language rarely emphasized. Words like privacy, independence, or community carried specific values and ideas that shaped how I understood relationships and society. Reading English books or listening to native speakers gave me insights into different perspectives. I realized that language is not neutral. It reflects the priorities, emotions, and history of the people who speak it. By thinking in English, I was not only practicing a skill, I was stepping into another way of seeing life. One vivid memory stays with me. I was reading an English novel late at night. The characters were discussing their dreams and fears. I noticed how the language allowed them to express vulnerability with phrases that sounded softer and more open than those in my native tongue. I tried to imagine the same scene in my own language, but it felt heavier and less natural. In that moment, I realized that English was not just another set of words. It was a different way of shaping thought itself. As I continued practicing, my creativity grew in other areas too. Writing in English gave me the courage to experiment with stories and essays. Because it was not my first language, I felt less bound by the strict rules of expression I had learned growing up. I gave myself permission to play with ideas, to use metaphors, and to express feelings in new ways. Some of my most creative thoughts came not in my native language but in English, because the language itself pushed me to think differently. Beyond creativity, thinking in English also expanded my worldview. Through English, I could connect with people from many countries. Their cultures, jokes, and ways of thinking became accessible to me. Conversations with friends from different backgrounds showed me how much language influences identity. For example, I once spoke with a friend from the United States who often used phrases about time like beating the clock or running out of time. These expressions revealed a culture that values speed and productivity. In contrast, my native language had fewer time-related idioms, which reflected a more relaxed attitude toward daily life. Realizing these differences made me more open-minded and empathetic toward other cultures. Thinking in English also made me aware of my own limitations. Sometimes I struggled to express complex feelings, and I had to search for words patiently. But in that process, I discovered that the struggle itself created growth. Each time I found the right word, my understanding of both English and myself deepened. Over time, I learned that my thoughts were not fixed. They could evolve depending on the language I used. This realization was empowering because it showed me that learning a language is not just about communication, it is about expanding the boundaries of who you are. Today, I see English not as a subject I studied in school but as a living tool that reshaped my mind. It allowed me to think faster, to describe more precisely, and to imagine more creatively. It gave me access to new ideas, different cultures, and a broader sense of the world. My native language remains my foundation, but English has added new rooms to the house of my thoughts. If someone were to ask me why I continue to practice thinking in English, my answer would be simple. Because it makes me more than who I was before. It does not replace my native tongue. Instead, it adds layers of perspective, imagination, and connection. Language shapes thought, and by choosing to think in English, I have expanded not only my ability to communicate but also the way I experience life itself. At the beginning of my English journey, I often wondered how I could bring the language into my daily life. I knew that memorizing vocabulary lists or reviewing grammar rules was not enough. What I needed was a way to make English present in every moment, to let it surround me and become natural. Over time, I discovered a set of practical strategies that made this possible. They were not complicated or expensive. Instead, they were small habits that slowly shaped my thinking and gave me confidence. One of the first things I tried was narrating my day. At first, it felt strange to describe my actions out loud in English, but it became a surprisingly powerful habit. If I was cooking breakfast, I would say to myself, I am cracking the eggs, I am slicing the bread, I am turning on the stove. The words were simple, but they forced me to connect the language to real actions. It was like giving a voice to my routine. Soon I realized that I did not need to wait for a classroom to practice English. My entire day could become a living textbook. Another useful technique was labeling objects around me. I remember taking sticky notes and writing words like mirror, window, chair, and refrigerator. I placed them all over my room and kitchen. Each time I looked at those objects, the English word came to my mind. This method helped me stop translating in my head. The refrigerator was no longer something I connected through my native language. It became refrigerator directly. Slowly, my environment turned into a kind of English dictionary that I could touch and see. Journaling in English also became a big part of my routine. At the end of each day, I would sit down with a notebook and write a few sentences about what had happened. In the beginning, I struggled to find the right words, and my grammar was often messy. But I reminded myself that the goal was not perfection but expression. Over time, my entries grew longer. I learned to describe my emotions, my thoughts, and even my dreams in English. This practice allowed me to think slowly and carefully. Writing gave me the chance to see where I was improving and where I needed to grow. It was like having a conversation with myself, but in another language. Consuming English media was another turning point. I used to watch movies and listen to songs in my native language, but once I switched to English, my progress accelerated. I started with shows that had subtitles so I could read and listen at the same time. Later, I challenged myself by removing the subtitles, relying only on my ears. Music also became a learning tool. I listened to songs repeatedly until I understood the lyrics. Sometimes I sang along, not caring if my pronunciation was perfect. By surrounding myself with English media, I turned entertainment into education without even realizing it. Practicing self-talk was something I found surprisingly effective. Whenever I had a few minutes alone, I would speak to myself in English. I talked about plans for the day, things I needed to do, or how I was feeling. For example, while walking to the store, I would think out loud, I need to buy some milk. Maybe I should also get some fruit. I wonder if there will be a discount today. This habit trained me to form sentences quickly without fear. It also built a stronger connection between my thoughts and the language, making English feel less foreign and more like a natural voice inside my head. Perhaps the most important strategy was talking with other learners. In the beginning, I was shy and worried about making mistakes, but speaking with people who were also learning made me feel safe. We encouraged each other, laughed at our errors, and celebrated small victories. Conversations with fellow learners reminded me that I was not alone in the struggle. Sometimes we practiced role plays, pretending to order food at a restaurant or ask for directions in the street. Other times we simply talked about our hobbies or shared our stories. These moments helped me realize that communication is not about being perfect. It is about connecting. Together, these strategies built a rhythm in my learning. Narrating my day gave me constant practice. Labeling objects connected words to my environment. Journaling strengthened my writing and reflection. English media improved my listening and vocabulary. Self-talk trained my fluency. Conversations with other learners gave me confidence. Each method supported the others, and over time, English stopped feeling like an academic subject and started becoming a part of who I was. Looking back, I see that these practical habits transformed my relationship with the language. Instead of waiting for opportunities, I created them in my everyday life. Instead of limiting English to a classroom, I invited it into my home, my thoughts, and my daily routine. The progress did not come overnight, but with each small step, my skills grew stronger. Now, when I look at my journey, I realize that English has become more than a language I study. It is a voice that I carry with me throughout the day. It is in the way I describe my breakfast, the songs I hum, the notes I write before bed, and the conversations I share with friends. These strategies taught me that learning a language is not about big leaps but about consistent steps. And each step, no matter how small, brings me closer to fluency. In the early stages of my English learning journey, I often felt like I was walking through a storm. Everything seemed uncertain and overwhelming. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and even exhaustion. But over time, I came to realize that challenges were not obstacles meant to stop me. They were lessons waiting to be embraced. Each mistake, each moment of fatigue, each small struggle was a chance to grow. By accepting these challenges instead of fearing them, I found my path forward. One of the first lessons I learned was to embrace mistakes. At the beginning, I was terrified of saying something wrong. I worried that people would laugh at me or judge me for mispronouncing a word or using the wrong tense. This fear kept me silent many times when I actually wanted to speak. But silence taught me nothing. The real progress started when I allowed myself to make errors openly. I still remember speaking to a tourist one afternoon and mixing up the past and present tense in every sentence. The tourist smiled kindly and continued the conversation without correcting me. That was when I realized mistakes were not disasters. They were stepping stones. Each wrong word showed me what I needed to learn next. By embracing mistakes, I turned fear into fuel. Another major challenge was managing fatigue. Learning a language is not a sprint, it is a marathon. First, I pushed myself too hard. I studied long hours, repeating vocabulary lists and grammar exercises until I felt drained. Instead of helping, this only made me resentful toward the process. Eventually, I understood that burnout was a real danger. I needed balance. So I began to divide my learning into smaller, manageable pieces. 20 minutes of focused reading felt more effective than 2 hours of forced study. Listening to an English podcast while walking outside gave me energy rather than draining it. By learning how to manage my fatigue, I discovered that consistency was far more valuable than intensity. Using simple words was another strategy that kept me moving forward. In the beginning, I thought I needed advanced vocabulary to sound intelligent. I tried memorizing long lists of complicated terms, but whenever I spoke, those words refused to come to mind. It left me frustrated and embarrassed. Then I reminded myself that communication is not about sounding impressive. It is about being understood. I began to focus on simple, everyday words. Instead of saying purchase, I said buy. Instead of utilize, I said use. Instead of attempting to construct long, complex sentences, I kept them short and clear. To my surprise, people responded more positively. They understood me easily, and this boosted my confidence. Simple words became my strongest tools, and they allowed me to build real connections. Staying persistent was perhaps the hardest lesson of all. There were days when I wanted to give up completely. I asked myself why I was putting so much effort into this language that still felt far from natural. On those days, progress felt invisible, but persistence meant continuing even when I could not see immediate results. I reminded myself that small steps added up over time. A short journal entry, a few minutes of conversation, or even a single new word learned each day was still progress. I kept going even when motivation was low because I trusted the process. Looking back, I see that persistence was the key that unlocked every door. Without it, I would never have reached the point where English started to feel comfortable. Tracking my progress was another way I overcame challenges. In the beginning, I felt as if I was not improving at all. But once I started keeping notes of what I had learned, everything changed. I wrote down new words I understood, grammar mistakes I corrected, and even conversations I managed to complete. I recorded short audio messages of myself speaking, then listened again weeks later. The difference shocked me. I could hear how my pronunciation was improving and how my sentences flowed more smoothly. These small records became proof that my efforts were working. Progress that felt invisible day by day became clear when I looked back. Tracking gave me motivation to continue and reminded me that success was not measured in leaps but in steady steps. Each of these lessons shaped my journey. Embracing mistakes taught me courage. Managing fatigue gave me balance. Using simple words built my confidence. Staying persistent taught me patience. Tracking my progress gave me motivation. Together, these strategies allowed me to transform obstacles into opportunities. Now, when I think about the challenges I faced, I no longer see them as painful memories. Instead, they are part of the story that made me stronger. Every mistake I made was a teacher. Every moment of fatigue reminded me to rest and keep balance. Every simple word I used carried the power of clarity. Every time I persisted, I built resilience. and every bit of progress I tracked became evidence that I was capable of growth. Looking back, I realized that challenges are not the enemy of learning. They are the very things that make learning possible. Without mistakes, I would never discover my weaknesses. Without fatigue, I would never learn the value of balance. Without persistence, I would never see results. Without tracking progress, I would never appreciate how far I have come. Today, English no longer feels like an impossible task. It feels like a part of my identity. And I know that I reached this point not because I avoided challenges, but because I embraced them. The journey continues, and there will always be new obstacles ahead. But I face them with a different attitude now. I know that every challenge is a hidden gift, and the more I embrace them, the stronger my skills will become. In the beginning, English was something I thought of only as a subject to be studied. It felt like math or history, something that belonged in a classroom with books, notebooks, and exams. I separated it from the rest of my life. I studied grammar rules, memorized vocabulary lists, and practiced dialogues that had little connection to my real experiences. It worked in small ways, but it never felt natural. I could remember rules but not apply them, and I could recall words but not use them in conversation. My English lived only on paper, not in my mind or in my daily world. Everything began to change when I started thinking in English. First, it was just an experiment. Instead of translating thoughts from my native language, I tried to form them directly in English. It felt strange in the beginning, almost uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that did not quite fit. My sentences were short and simple. Sometimes I had to pause for long moments to find the right word. But with time, this practice started to change not just my English but also my relationship with the language itself. Thinking in English transformed learning into something that was no longer just study. It became a habit, a part of my daily life. I began with small things. As I looked outside, I would tell myself quietly, "The sun is bright today." When I felt hungry, I would think, "I need food." When I planned my schedule, I would organize it in English. At first, it seemed almost childish, but over time those small habits built a new foundation in my mind. English was no longer something I visited only during study sessions. It was becoming a natural environment in which my thoughts lived. The change was gradual but powerful. I noticed that communication became faster. Before, every conversation felt like a puzzle. I would listen in English, translate to my native language, think of an answer, then translate it back into English. By the time I was ready to respond, the moment had already passed. Thinking in English removed those extra steps. My answers became quicker, and my mind felt lighter. For the first time, conversations flowed instead of stumbling. This transformation also built my confidence. Speaking used to fill me with fear because I worried about mistakes. But as I grew used to forming thoughts directly in English, I trusted myself more. My sentences were not perfect, but they were mine. I was no longer performing memorized lines from a textbook. I was expressing real thoughts that gave me courage to speak, even when I knew I might not get everything right. Confidence was not about perfection. It was about honesty and expression, and thinking in English gave me that honesty. Listening also became easier. In the past, I often felt lost in conversations or while watching movies. I would hear words, but by the time I translated them in my head, the next sentence had already gone by. It was exhausting. Thinking in English made listening smoother. My brain no longer needed to carry the heavy load of constant translation. Instead, I could focus on meaning, tone, and context. English stopped being noise and became a language I could actually hear and understand in real time. Perhaps the most meaningful part of this transformation was self-expression. When I thought in my native language, English felt like a tool, something outside of me. But when I thought in English, it became part of who I was. My ideas, emotions, and observations were shaped directly through it. I found new ways to describe my feelings and experiences. English gave me words that my native language did not always have, and through that, my perspective expanded. Thinking in English was not only about learning a language, it was about living in a new way. Over time, my daily habits grew stronger. I labeled objects in my room with English names. I narrated my day to myself like a storyteller. I wrote short journal entries about simple events. I even talked to myself in English when I was alone, asking questions and answering them as if I were having a conversation. These small acts were not just practice. They were evidence that English had become woven into my life. The biggest realization I had was that learning stopped being something separate from living. It was no longer about spending an hour with a textbook and then closing it. Every moment became an opportunity to live inside the language. Walking to the store, I thought of the words for the things I saw. Watching the sky, I described the colors in English. Planning my future, I imagined it in English sentences. The line between learning and living disappeared, and that was the true transformation. Looking back, I see how powerful this change has been. Thinking in English turned my relationship with the language from a student and a subject into something much deeper. It gave me speed in communication, confidence in speaking, clarity in listening, and freedom in expression. It also gave me joy because it no longer felt like a burden of study but like a new dimension of life. Today, English is not just something I learn. It is something I live. The journey is still ongoing, but now it feels natural. I do not need to force myself to practice because the habit is already inside me. English has become part of my thoughts, part of my daily rhythm, and part of who I am. That is the true transformation. Learning English became living in English.